barriers to work with defense firms, you're doing that here in Sweden, and we can learn from you. As you build transatlantic partnerships or pan-European partnerships or global partnerships with other like-minded nations, we can learn from you. And as you create opportunities for co-production and co-development, we can learn from Sweden. Sweden's industrial base is already doing these things and demonstrating that it can deliver. Yesterday, I heard the phrase "made with Sweden" in stark contrast to the other phrase that you might have chosen, a more protectionist phrase of "made in Sweden." This is fantastic. All allies would benefit from adopting this mentality, as a rising tide lifts all boats. So, in conclusion, everything I'm seeing from Sweden, the collaboration, the modernization efforts, the defense investments, the health of your defense industry, frankly, I think someone gave you all a checklist for being a model ally, and you just went down and started checking it off. So it's a real privilege to be here today with you today with a model ally who's doing so much for the alliance, and I truly look forward to your question.
Commentarios 1407. Okay, so the Pentagon just sent a message to Donald Trump that nobody saw coming. And it didn't come from Democrats, it didn't come from the media. It came from his own top generals. We're talking about active duty military leadership, people Trump himself appointed or promoted, people who are supposed to be on his side, publicly warning the sitting president of the United States that he's crossing lines that cannot be crossed. This isn't some leak from a disgruntled staffer. This isn't anonymous sources. This is on-the-record pushback from the very institution Trump depends on to project American power around the world. And right now, the White House is scrambling to figure out how to respond without looking like they've lost control of the military itself. Now, before we get into what exactly these generals said and why this is such a massive problem for Trump, heading into the second half of 2026, let me just say something real quick. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. They'll spin this story 100 different ways depending on which network you're watching, but they won't give you the full picture. That's why we built US Power Alert, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's actually happening inside the institutions that run this country, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, this is your moment. Subscribe. Here's what happened. Over the past week, at least 3 senior military officials, we're talking Joint Chiefs level, combatant commanders, people who oversee entire theaters of operation, have made public statements that directly contradict Trump's recent orders on troop deployments, rules of engagement, and the use of military assets for domestic operations. The most explosive moment came during a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing on Tuesday, when General Michael Langley, the commander overseeing operations in Africa and parts of the Middle East, was asked point-blank whether he would follow a presidential order to deploy active duty troops to the southern border under a national emergency declaration without congressional approval. His answer? Senator, I would need to consult with legal counsel to ensure any such order complies with the Posse Comitatus Act and does not violate constitutional limits on the use of the military in domestic law enforcement. That's Pentagon speak for, I'm not doing that unless someone proves to me it's legal, but it didn't stop there. Within 24 hours, General Gregory Guillot, who commands U.S. Northern Command, the very command responsible for defending the homeland and coordinating with domestic agencies, gave an interview to Defense News, where he said, and I'm quoting here, "The United States military is not a political tool. We serve the Constitution, not any individual administration. There are legal frameworks that govern what we can and cannot do on American soil, and those frameworks exist for a reason." He didn't mention Trump by name, but everyone knows exactly who he was talking about. And then, just yesterday, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the chief of naval operations, told reporters at a Pentagon briefing that any order that asks the military to operate outside established norms, outside congressional oversight, or outside the bounds of lawful command authority will be subject to rigorous legal review before execution. She added, "We are not in the business of freelancing national security policy. Now, let me be very clear about what's happening here. These are not political generals. These are not Obama holdovers. General Langley was promoted under Trump's first term. Admiral Franchetti is the first woman to serve as CNO, appointed by Biden, but confirmed with bipartisan support and kept in place by Trump when he came back into office. General Guillot has been in uniform for over 3 decades and has served under Republican and Democratic administrations alike. These are career military professionals who have spent their entire lives staying out of politics. And the fact that they are now speaking publicly in coordinated fashion about constitutional limits on presidential power tells you everything you need to know about how dangerous things have gotten inside the Trump White House. So, what exactly is Trump trying to do that has his own generals issuing public warnings? Well, it all goes back to a series of executive orders Trump signed in late April 2026, right after a series of terrorist incidents along the southern border that his administration has been calling the Nuevo Laredo crisis. The details are still murky, but what we know is that there were at least 2 violent confrontations between smuggling cartels and U.S. Border Patrol agents, resulting in the deaths of 3 federal officers and dozens of civilians on the Mexican side. Trump immediately declared a national emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and the Insurrection Act. Yes, the Insurrection Act, the same law that allows a president to deploy active-duty military to suppress domestic unrest. He ordered 15,000 active-duty troops to the border, gave them expanded rules of engagement that reportedly include authorization to use lethal force against armed incursions, and issued classified instructions to Northern Command that, according to leaks, involve the military conducting surveillance, detention operations, and even proactive interdiction on U.S. soil without warrants or local law enforcement coordination. And here's the problem. The Posse Comitatus Act, which has been federal law since 1878, explicitly prohibits the use of the military for domestic law enforcement unless Congress authorizes it or the Constitution explicitly allows it. The Insurrection Act is one of the narrow exceptions, but it was designed for things like full-scale riots, armed rebellions, or situations where local and state authorities have completely lost control and are asking for federal help. It was not designed to be a blank check for a president to militarize immigration enforcement or turn the southern border into a combat zone. Legal experts across the political spectrum, including former military lawyers, constitutional scholars, and even some Trump-aligned think tanks, have been saying for weeks that this is a massive overreach, that it sets a precedent that any future president could use to deploy troops domestically for almost any reason, just by declaring an emergency and invoking the Insurrection Act. But Trump doesn't care. His position, according to sources inside the administration, is that the border crisis is a national security emergency on par with an invasion, and that he has inherent constitutional authority as commander-in-chief to use the military to defend U.S. territory from foreign threats. His legal team has been pointing to a series of old Office of Legal Counsel memos from the Bush and Obama years that gave presidents broad latitude in emergencies. And they've been arguing that because Mexico has lost control of the cartels, the U.S. is effectively facing a cross-border insurgency that justifies a military response. Stephen Miller, who's back in the White House as a senior advisor, has reportedly been the driving force behind this strategy, pushing Trump to go big, go bold, and dare Congress or the courts to stop him. And that's exactly what's happening. On Monday, a coalition of 23 Democratic senators and 4 Republican senators, including Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Mitt Romney, and Todd Young, introduced a resolution to terminate Trump's emergency declaration under the National Emergencies Act. The resolution has enough votes to pass the Senate, and if it gets to Trump's desk, he'll veto it. But the fact that it's even happening shows you how much resistance there is, even within his own party, to what he's doing. Meanwhile, the ACLU, along with several border states and immigrant advocacy groups, filed an emergency lawsuit in federal court in San Diego, arguing that Trump's orders violate Posse Comitatus, the Fourth Amendment, and separation of powers. The case is moving fast, and there's a hearing scheduled for next week in front of Judge Cynthia Bashand, who has a history of ruling against executive overreach. But here's where it gets worse. The White House isn't backing down. In fact, they're doubling down. On Wednesday, Trump gave an interview to a friendly conservative outlet where he said, quote, "I don't care what some judge in California thinks. I don't care what some general who's spent too much time in Washington thinks. The American people elected me to secure the border, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. If that means using the full power of the military, so be it. If that means ignoring politically motivated lawsuits, so be it. I took an oath to defend this country, and I'm not going to let lawyers and bureaucrats stop me from doing my job. He went on to say that any general who refuses to follow his orders should be prepared to find a new job, and that he's already looking at replacements for officials who don't have the stomach for what he's calling the new reality of border security. Now, let's break down what this actually means. First, understand that the military does not work for Donald Trump personally. The military works for the Constitution. Every single officer, from the lowest second lieutenant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, swears an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. They do not swear an oath to the president. They swear an oath to the document that limits the president's power. That's not some technicality. That's the entire foundation of civilian control of the military in a democracy. The reason we have never had a military coup in the United States, the reason we have never had generals refusing to leave power or using their troops to settle political disputes, is because the military sees itself as subordinate to the law, not to any individual leader. Second, what Trump is doing right now is testing that principle in a way that no modern president has ever done. He's not just asking the military to do something controversial. He's asking them to do something that many legal experts believe is flatly unconstitutional. And he's doing it while publicly threatening to fire anyone who questions him. That puts military leaders in an impossible position. If they follow the order and it turns out to be illegal, they could be personally liable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If they refuse the order and Trump fires them, he can replace them with yes men who will do whatever he says, which makes the problem even worse. And if they stay silent and just slow roll implementation, they're effectively engaging in a quiet rebellion against the commander-in-chief, which is its own constitutional crisis. Third, this is happening at a time when the United States military is already stretched thin. We've got ongoing operations in Eastern Europe supporting Ukraine. We've got a growing confrontation with China in the South China Sea. We've got counterterrorism missions in Africa and the Middle East. And now Trump wants to pull 15,000 active duty troops off those missions to patrol the border and conduct what amounts to domestic law enforcement. Combatant commanders are furious about this because it degrades readiness. It sends a terrible message to allies who depend on us, and it makes it harder to respond if there's a real crisis somewhere else in the world. One senior defense official told Politico this week, on background, that we're being asked to choose between defending the country from external threats and defending the president from his own terrible ideas, and that's not a choice we should ever have to make. Fourth, this is having a massive political impact. Republicans who thought Trump had learned his lesson after 2020, who thought he would govern more cautiously in a second term, are realizing that he's doing the exact opposite. He's pushing the limits of executive power further than ever before, and he's doing it in a way that's forcing them to either back him completely or break with him publicly. The 4 Republican senators who signed onto the resolution to terminate the emergency are being attacked relentlessly by MAGA media and grassroots activists, but they're also getting quiet support from other senators who are terrified of what happens if Trump succeeds in militarizing the border without congressional oversight. And on the Democratic side, this is being treated as Exhibit A in the case for why Trump is a threat to democracy, why he cannot be trusted with power, and why 2026 is the most important midterm election in modern history. Fifth, this is doing serious damage to America's credibility with allies. European leaders, who are already nervous about Trump's threats to pull out of NATO and his coziness with Putin, are watching this and asking themselves whether the United States is still a stable, rule of law democracy, or whether it's sliding into something more authoritarian. Ukraine, which depends on U.S. military support to survive, is terrified that Trump is going to use the border crisis as an excuse to cut aid and refocus resources domestically. And countries in Latin America, who have been working with the U.S. on migration and security issues, are seeing this as a betrayal and a sign that Trump views them as enemies rather than partners. Mexico's president gave a speech earlier this week where she said, "We will not tolerate military incursions. We will not tolerate threats, and we will not cooperate with a government that treats migration as an act of war. That's a direct shot at Trump, and it's a sign that this crisis is not just domestic, it's blowing up our relationships across the hemisphere. Sixth, markets are starting to freak out. Investors hate uncertainty. And what's happening right now is peak uncertainty. You've got a president openly defying legal norms. You've got the military pushing back publicly. You've got Congress in open revolt. You've got lawsuits flying, and nobody knows how this is going to end. Defense stocks are up because people think this means more military spending, but pretty much everything else is down because people are worried about political instability. The dollar has weakened against major currencies. Bond yields are spiking because investors are demanding higher returns to compensate for risk, and analysts are starting to talk about the possibility of a constitutional crisis affecting credit ratings and long-term growth projections. Seventh, and this is maybe the most important point, what happens next depends entirely on whether the military stands firm or blinks. If generals continue to push back, if they slow-roll implementation, if they demand legal reviews and congressional authorization before deploying troops in ways that violate posse comitatus, then Trump's plan falls apart. He can fire a few generals, but he can't fire the entire officer corps. And if he tries, he risks a full-blown mutiny and a collapse of command authority. But if the military blinks, if they decide that it's easier to follow orders and let the courts sort it out later, then Trump wins and the precedent is set. Any future president, Republican or Democrat, will be able to point to this moment and say, well, Trump did it, so I can do it too. That's how democracies die. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of precedents that slowly erode the rules until there are no rules left. So here's the bottom line. The United States military, the most powerful fighting force in human history, is being put in a position where it has to choose between following the orders of the sitting president and upholding the Constitution. That should never happen. That's the kind of thing that happens in unstable countries, in places where the rule of law is weak and institutions are captured by strongmen. But it's happening here in 2026 in the United States of America because Donald Trump believes that he has the authority to do whatever he wants as long as he can call it a national emergency. And his own generals are telling him publicly that he's wrong. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Imagine you're a mid-level military officer, maybe a colonel or a brigadier general, and you get an order to deploy your troops to the border to conduct detention operations without warrants, to surveil American citizens without probable cause, to use lethal force based on rules of engagement that may or may not comply with international law. What do? Do you follow the order and hope that someone above you takes responsibility if it goes wrong? Do you refuse the order and risk getting court-martialed or fired? Do you ask for a legal review and hope that buys you time? There's no good answer, and that's exactly the kind of impossible situation that Trump is creating for thousands of service members right now. And let's be honest, this isn't just about the border. This is about whether we still have a system where the president is bound by law, where Congress has a say in how military force is used, where courts can check executive overreach, and where the military serves the Constitution rather than the whims of whoever happens to be in the Oval Office. If Trump gets away with this, if he can deploy troops domestically, bypass posse comitatus, ignore congressional resolutions, defy court orders, and fire any general who questions him, then we no longer have a republic. We have something else. The next few weeks are going to be absolutely critical. Watch what happens in federal court in San Diego. Watch whether more Republican senators join the resolution to terminate the emergency. Watch whether any senior generals resign in protest or whether they stay and fight from the inside. Watch whether Trump actually tries to fire military leaders who won't comply. And watch how the Pentagon responds if he does. Watch whether Mexico retaliates economically or diplomatically. Watch whether NATO allies start distancing themselves from the U.S. or expressing concerns about American political stability. And watch the polls, because if Trump's approval numbers start tanking over this, if suburban voters and independents start seeing him as dangerous rather than strong, that changes the calculation for Republicans in Congress heading into the midterms. This is one of those moments where the stakes are so high that it's hard to overstate them. We're not talking about a policy disagreement. We're not talking about a political fight over tax rates or health care. We're talking about the fundamental structure of American government, the relationship between civilian and military authority, and the question of whether the United States is still a country governed by law or whether we've crossed into something much darker, and the fact that Trump's own generals are issuing public warnings, the fact that they're citing the Constitution in opposition to presidential orders, tells you everything you need to know about how serious this has become. So here's my question for you, and I really want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the military will stand firm and refuse to follow illegal orders? Or do you think they'll eventually cave to pressure from the White House? Do you think Congress has the guts to actually override Trump's veto and terminate the emergency? Or are Republicans too scared of the base to break with him? And do you think this is going to be the issue that finally turns public opinion against Trump in a major way? Or is this just going to be one more thing that gets normalized because we've already normalized so much? Drop your thoughts below because this is a conversation we need to be having right now. And I want to know where you stand. This story is far from over, and how it ends is going to define American politics for the next decade.